The heavy, black resin of the Montblanc fountain pen felt like a lead weight in Minho Park's hand. It was an instrument of luxury, designed for signing treaties and authorizing fortunes, but tonight, in the dimly lit private room of the Sapphire Lounge, it felt like a weapon turned against its master. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic, mocking tick of a grandfather clock standing in the corner, marking the seconds of an empire crumbling into dust. Minho, a man who had once commanded the respect of the sprawling, intricate underworld of Seoul's syndicate operations, sat slumped in a leather chair that suddenly felt too large for him. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, were rimmed with red, dull with the exhaustion of a 3-month siege that had been fought not with knives or guns, but with forensic accountants, frozen assets, and betrayals. Across the mahogany table sat Director Choi. Choi did not look like a gangster. He looked like a shark in a bespoke Italian suit. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped, watching the pen hover over the dotted line. There was no gleam of triumph in Choi's eyes, only the cold, bored expectation of a butcher waiting for the animal to stop thrashing. The document beneath Minho's hand was thick, bound in blue legal paper. The Bankruptcy and Asset Liquidation Agreement. It was a surrender, a complete capitulation. Signing this meant Minho would strip himself of his legacy, his territory, and his honor to save his subordinates from prison and his family from destitution. A bead of sweat, heavy and cold, rolled down Minho's temple, tracing the line of a scar he had earned 20 years ago in a street fight that had started his ascent. It dropped onto the polished wood of the table with a tiny, audible plip. His hand trembled, just a fraction. But in this world, a tremble was a scream. The nib of the pen lowered, the black ink dark and wet, ready to stain the paper forever. The metal tip touched the fiber of the page. The friction of gold on paper was about to seal his fate. We have all stood here, not in a Mafia backroom, perhaps, but at the edge of a moment where we believe we have no choice left. We look at the ruins of our efforts, and we convince ourselves that surrender is the only logical path. We tell ourselves that the game is over, unaware that the rules are being rewritten by someone we haven't even noticed standing in the room. Before we unpause this moment of devastation, I need you to comment below with where you are watching from tonight, and what time it is in your part of the world. It helps us connect. Now look closely. Not at the men. Look at the background. Look at the red vest in the shadows. The atmosphere in the private dining room was suffocating, thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of fear. Outside the heavy velvet curtains, the city of Seoul was likely bustling with neon life, but in here, it felt like a tomb. Director Choi cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves being crushed. He tapped his finger on the desk, inches away from the document. "It is the only way, Minho," Choi said, his voice smooth, lacking any jagged edges of malice which made it all the more terrifying. "You fought well, but the ledger does not lie. Your liquidity is gone. Your accounts are frozen. If you do not sign, the authorities move in tomorrow morning. If you sign, I absorb the debt, and your people walk away clean. It is mercy, mercy." The word tasted like ash in Minho's mouth. He looked up at Choi, trying to find the lie, but Choi was a master of the corporate kill. This was the new era of organized crime. No more bloody street wars. It was all shell companies, leveraged buyouts, and hostile takeovers. Minho was a dinosaur, a relic of a time when a man's word was his bond and respect was currency. He had been outmaneuvered by algorithms and shadow investors. "Mercy," Minho repeated, his voice raspy. "You take my grandfather's district. You take the shipping lines. And you call it mercy." Choi shrugged, a microscopic movement of his shoulders. "I call it business. The shipping lines are hemorrhaging money. I am doing you a favor taking them off your hands. Please. The ink is drying." Minho looked back down. The words on the page swam before his eyes. Clause 1. Total divestment of all assets held by the Park Trust. Clause 2. Assumption of all liabilities by Choi Holdings. It looked standard. It looked legal. It looked like the end. He gripped the pen tighter, his knuckles turning white. He thought of his lieutenants, men who had served him for decades, waiting outside in the rain. He thought of his daughter, studying art in Paris, unaware that her tuition account was empty. He had to save them. He had to be the martyr. The defeat settled into his bones, heavy and final. He adjusted his grip, preparing to sign the characters of his name that would erase his existence. In the corner of the room, standing so still she might have been part of the wallpaper, Simone shifted her weight from one aching foot to the other. She was 27 years old, African-American, with her hair pulled back in a tight, practical bun that pulled at her scalp. She wore the standard uniform of the Sapphire Lounge, a crisp white button-down shirt that was slightly too large at the shoulders and a crimson-red vest that was slightly too tight at the waist. She had been invisible for the last 2 hours. To men like Min-ho Park and director Choi, she was not a person. She was a mechanism that delivered water, cleared ashtrays, and refilled scotch glasses. She was furniture with a pulse. But Simone was not furniture. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, were currently locked onto the paperwork spread across the table. She wasn't supposed to look. The first rule of high-end service, especially when serving the heavy clientele, was discretion. You see nothing. You hear nothing. You speak only when spoken to. But Simone couldn't help it. Her mind was a hungry thing, sharpened by 4 years of night classes at the City University, where she was grinding toward a degree in forensic accounting. She spent her days sleeping in a cramped apartment and her nights poring over textbooks about tax law, embezzlement schemes, and corporate bankruptcy filings. She worked double shifts at the Sapphire Lounge to pay the tuition that was always due, always looming. She stepped forward silently, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of her sensible black work shoes. She carried a crystal pitcher of ice water, condensation weeping down the sides and dripping onto her hand. She approached the table to refill Min-ho's empty glass. As she poured, the water splashing softly against the ice, her gaze fell on the upside-down text of the contract. To most, upside-down legalese would be gibberish. To Simone, who studied flashcards on the subway until her eyes burned, the patterns of the text stood out. She saw the standard boilerplate clauses. She saw the liquidation schedules. And then, her eyes caught the footnote on the bottom of page 3, right where Min-ho's hand was resting. It was a section referencing the asset valuation protocol. Simone's heart hammered against her ribs. She blinked, looking again. The text was small, size 8 font, designed to be glazed over. Valuation of assets to be determined by the 2021 Fiscal Adjustment Index, exclusive of real estate holdings in Zone 4. Zone 4. She knew Zone 4. She had read about the redistricting in the newspaper just that morning on her break. Zone 4 had just been reclassified by the city government as a high-density commercial tech hub. The value of land there hadn't just doubled, it had quadrupled overnight. If the contract excluded Zone 4 from the valuation, then Min-ho wasn't just handing over a failing business. He was handing over a gold mine for free. He wasn't bankrupt. If he sold that land at fair market value, he could pay off every debt he had and still walk away a rich man. The water in the pitcher trembled as her hands shook. She took a breath. This was not her place. These were dangerous men. One was a crime lord, the other a corporate shark. If she spoke, she would be fired. That was the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario involved the dark rumors she heard in the kitchen about what happens to people who interrupt the syndicate's business. She should step back. She should fade into the shadows. She should let the old man sign his life away. It wasn't her fight. But then she looked at Min-ho's face. She saw the defeat etched into the lines around his eyes. It was the same look her father had worn when the bank took their house back in the States. The look of a man who believes the system has crushed him, unaware that the system was rigged. Min-ho's pen touched the paper again. The first stroke of his signature began to form, a sharp black line curving upward. The sound of the nib scratching the paper was loud in the silence. Simone felt a physical jolt in her chest. It was an instinct, sharper than fear, deeper than self-preservation. It was the refusal to watch a lie become the truth. Wait. The word was barely a whisper, but it landed like a gunshot in the silent room. Min-ho's hand froze. The pen jerked, leaving a jagged splutter of ink on the page, ruining the elegance of the signature. For a second, no one moved. The grandfather clock ticked. Tick, tock. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, Director Choi turned his head. His neck cracked. He looked at Simone with an expression of mild, icy confusion, as if a lamp had just started speaking to him. "Excuse me?" Choi said, his voice dropping an octave. The menace was palpable now, radiating off him like heat from a pavement. Min-ho didn't look up immediately. He stared at the ink blots spreading on the paper, his chest heaving. He was disoriented, pulled back from the edge of the cliff by a voice he didn't recognize. Slowly, he lifted his head, his tired eyes finding the waitress in the red vest. He saw a young woman clutching a water pitcher like a shield, her eyes wide with terror, but her chin set with a strange, stubborn defiance. "I said, wait," Simone repeated, her voice gaining a fraction more strength, though her knees felt like they were made of water. She set the pitcher down on a side table to stop it from shaking. She wiped her damp hands on her vest. "Don't sign that, sir." Choi stood up. It was a fluid motion like a snake uncoiling. He was taller than he looked while seated. "Get out," he hissed, pointing a manicured finger at the door. "You are dismissed. Leave the room immediately, or you won't just lose your job." Simone flinched, but she didn't step back. She looked directly at Min-ho, ignoring the predator standing to her left. "The valuation clause," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush of nervous energy. Page 3, footnote 12. It excludes Zone 4 real estate from the asset total. Min-ho frowned, confusion knitting his brows. "What?" "Zone 4, Simone said, pointing a trembling finger at the document, avoiding touching it. "The city council rezoned it this morning. It's not industrial wasteland anymore. It's a tech hub." The land value spiked 400% at 9 a.m. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "If you sign this, you're agreeing to value that land at last year's prices. You're not bankrupt, sir. You're sitting on a surplus. He's not bailing you out. He's stealing a fortune and making you thank him for it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. Choi's face lost its mask of bored indifference. A flash of genuine, unfiltered rage contorted his features. He looked at the document, then at Min-ho, then at Simone. He had been caught. Not by a lawyer, not by a rival boss, but by the waitress who refilled the water. Min-ho slowly lowered the pen. The tip hovered over the table, then clattered down onto the wood. He didn't look at Choi. He looked at Simone, really seeing her for the first time. He saw the intelligence behind the fear. He reached out, his hand no longer shaking, and turned the page to the footnote she had indicated. He read it. He paused. He read it again. Then a low sound started in his chest. It rumbled upward, growing in volume until it broke the tension of the room. It was a laugh. A dry, disbelief-filled laugh. "Zone 4, Minho whispered." He looked up at Choi, and the predator was back in his eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp fury. "You tried to hustle me, Choi?" With a zoning technicality. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." Choi snapped, but his voice was too quick, too defensive. He reached for the papers. "This is a complex merger. A waitress cannot understand the intricacies of—" "I understand math," Simone cut in, her voice steadying as she fell back on the logic that made sense to her. "And I understand that hiding a primary asset in a footnote of a liquidation agreement constitutes fraud under Article 347 of the Criminal Code. If you sign that, he owns the land. If you don't, you can leverage the new valuation against your debt and restructure. You don't have to sell anything." Min-ho placed his hand flat on the papers, pinning them down so Choi couldn't remove them. He looked at the waitress, this African-American woman in a red vest who had just saved his life with a pitcher of water in one hand and a legal statute in the other. "What is your name?" Min-ho asked, his voice quiet and respectful. "Simone," she whispered. "Simone Jackson." "Well, Simone Jackson," Min-ho said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips as he looked at the sweating villain across the table. "Please, pour Mr. Choi a glass of water. He looks like he is about to choke." Director Choi did not choke, but the color drained from his face so rapidly it was as if a drain plug had been pulled beneath his skin. The silence that reclaimed the room was no longer the heavy, suffocating blanket of Minho's defeat. It was electric, sharp, and vibrating with a sudden, violent shift in the balance of power. The air conditioner hummed, a low mechanical drone that seemed to grow louder, underscoring the tension. Choi stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, a jarring noise that made Simone flinch. He smoothed his tie, a nervous, erratic gesture that betrayed the composure he was desperate to maintain. He looked at Simone not with the dismissal of a patron to a server, but with the venom of a gambler who realizes the dealer has caught him counting cards. "This is preposterous." Choi spat, his voice tight. He looked at Minho, trying to re-establish the dominance he had held only moments ago. "You're going to take financial advice from help? From a girl who pours water? She sees a zoning notice and thinks she understands high-level asset liquidation. Minho, be reasonable. The market fluctuates. Zone 4 is a speculation bubble. If you listen to her, you risk everything. Sign the papers. Secure your family's safety. Don't let a moment of fantasy ruin your last chance at dignity." Minho didn't answer immediately. He was watching Choi with a gaze that had regained its predatory weight. The old lion had woken up. Minho slowly capped the fountain pen, the same pen that had almost signed his death warrant, and set it down with a deliberate, heavy clack. He picked up the document, his movements unhurried, agonizingly slow for the man standing opposite him. He turned to page 3. He read the footnote again. Then he looked at the date stamp on the top of the page. It was dated yesterday. Choi had known. He had drafted this knowing the rezoning was coming, knowing the land value would skyrocket, and he had tried to buy it for pennies on the dollar before the news hit the public wires. It wasn't just business. It was theft wrapped in the guise of salvation. "Sit down, Simone," Minho said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, but one born of sudden, intense curiosity rather than authority. He gestured to the empty leather chair beside him, the chair usually reserved for consiglieres and high-ranking lieutenants. Simone froze. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to grab her tray, back out of the room, and disappear into the kitchen where it was safe, where the only danger was a hot plate or a cranky chef. Sitting at the table with the bosses was forbidden. It broke every rule of the hierarchy. But then she looked at Choi's sneering face, and she looked at the terrified hope in Minho's eyes. She realized that she had already crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back to being invisible. She took a shaky breath, the smell of cigar smoke filling her lungs, and walked around the table. She sat in the leather chair. It was soft, swallowing her small frame. She felt ridiculous in her cheap red vest next to their Italian wool suits, but she placed her hands on the table, interlacing her fingers to stop them from trembling. "Explain it," Minho said, sliding the heavy document toward her. "Show me the math." Choi scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "This is a farce. I'm leaving." "You will stay right there," Minho said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble that vibrated through the table. He didn't look up from Simone. "If you leave, my men outside will assume negotiations have failed. And you know what happens when negotiations fail." Choi sat back down, stiff and pale. He was trapped. Simone pulled the paper closer. Her fear began to recede, replaced by the familiar, comforting logic of numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't care about mafia bosses or red vests. She pointed to the valuation column. "Here," she said, her voice gaining strength, shedding the servile tone of a waitress, and adopting the clinical precision of an accountant. "The contract locks the land value at $400 per square foot. That's the industrial rate. But the Zone 4 announcement this morning reclassifies it as mixed-use commercial high density. I checked the comps for similar zones in the Gangnam district. They're trading at $1,800 per square foot minimum. Even with a conservative estimate, your holdings in Zone 4 aren't worth $10 million each." She looked up, meeting Minho's eyes directly. "They're worth $45 million. Enough to cover the insolvency gap, pay off the lien on the shipping lines, and leave you with a $6 million operating surplus." The room fell silent again, but this time, it was the silence of revelation. Minho looked at the numbers. He did the mental math. $45 million. It wasn't just a lifeline. It was a war chest. He looked at Choi, whose face was now a mask of shiny, sweaty defeat. The calculator had been outcalculated. The man who weaponized logic had been disarmed by a student who memorized tax codes on the night bus. Minho let out a long, slow exhale, the tension of 3 months leaving his body. He felt light. He felt dangerous. He looked at Simone with a mixture of awe and confusion. You calculated the comps based on Gangnam density models? He asked. I have a midterm on real estate valuation next Tuesday, Simone said, a small, shy smile touching her lips. I've been studying the heat maps all week.
Minho left.
It was a genuine, booming sound that startled the stillness of the room. He turned to Choi, his expression hardening into stone. You heard the lady, Choi. My assets are undervalued. The deal is off. We have a verbal agreement, Choi stammered, desperate now, clutching at straws. We have nothing. Minho cut him off. He picked up the blue document, the symbol of his near destruction. He held it up in the dim light. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was louder than a gunshot. He tore it again and again until the bankruptcy agreement was nothing but a pile of blue confetti on the mahogany table. The only thing we have is a failed negotiation and a witness to your attempted fraud. Minho leaned forward, his elbows resting on the shredded paper. Here is the new deal. You're going to walk out of here. You're going to tell your investors that the park syndicate refused to sell. And then you're going to stay out of Zone 4. Because if I see one of your shell companies trying to buy land in my district, I will send this young woman to the district attorney with this contract and her testimony. Attempted grand larceny is a bad look for a legitimate businessman, isn't it? Choi looked at Simone. He looked at the red vest, the name tag that was slightly crooked, the sensible shoes. He looked at the person he had ignored, the variable he hadn't accounted for. Hate burned in his eyes, but fear burned brighter. He stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and without a word, turned and marched out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. Minho slumped back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked 10 years younger. He looked at the grandfather clock. It was 11:45 p.m. 5 minutes ago, he was a ruined man. Now he was a king again. He turned his head to Simone. She was still sitting there, looking suddenly small again, the adrenaline fading, leaving her wondering if she was about to be fired or killed. She started to stand up. I should get back to work. The manager will be looking for me. Sit, Minho said gently. He reached for the crystal pitcher, the same one she had used as an excuse to enter the room, and poured a glass of water. He slid it across the table to her. It was a gesture of immense respect. In his culture, the elder pours for the younger only when honor is due. The manager will not be looking for you. I will speak to him. Simone took the glass, her fingers curling around the cold crystal. I didn't mean to intrude, sir. I couldn't watch you sign it. It wasn't right. Why? Minho asked. He studied her face, the fatigue under her eyes, the callus on her finger from holding a pen. Why save me? You don't know me. I am not a good man, Simone. The papers call me a criminal. I don't know about that, Simone said quietly. I just know what it looks like when someone uses fancy words to steal from people who are tired. My dad. He was a mechanic. Good with cars, bad with contracts. He signed a loan he couldn't read because the man in the suit smiled at him. We lost the shop. We lost the house. She took a sip of water. I promised myself I'd learn the language of the suits. So they couldn't do it to me, or anyone I was standing near. Minho nodded slowly, absorbing this. The language of the suits, he repeated. You speak it better than they do. He looked at the pile of torn paper. You are studying? At the university? Yes, sir. Forensic accounting. 2 semesters left. And you pay for this by carrying trays at the Sapphire Lounge. Yes, sir. Minho reached into his jacket pocket. For a second, Simone tensed, but he pulled out a business card. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. My organization is transitioning, Minho said, choosing his words carefully. We are moving away from the streets and into the boardrooms. We have shipping logistics, construction firms, real estate holdings in Zone 4 that apparently need managing. He looked at her intensely. I have many men who can break legs. I have very few who can read footnotes. I don't need a waitress, Simone. I need an auditor. Someone who can see the invisible mistakes before they kill us. Simone looked at the card. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a lifeline. It was the end of the double shifts, the end of the aching feet, the end of the fear that she wouldn't make tuition. I can't pay you a gangster's wage, Minho said with a dry smile. But I can pay for your tuition. And a salary that matches your skill, not your uniform. You finish your degree. You work for me. You keep my enemies honest. Simone picked up the card. It felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. She looked at Minho, the humbled leader who had almost lost everything, and saw a man who was offering her respect. I have class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, she said, her voice steady. Then we will schedule the racketeering meetings for Wednesdays, Minho replied, deadpan. Simone smiled. It was a real smile this time, bright and relieved. She stood up, smoothing her red vest. Thank you, Mr. Park. No. Minho stood up as well and bowed his head slightly, a shock to anyone who knew who he was. Thank you, Ms. Jackson. As Simone walked out of the private room, the grandfather clock struck midnight. The heavy chime resonated through the room, but it no longer sounded like a countdown to doom. It sounded like a new day. It is easy to underestimate the person standing in the shadows. We judge value by the suit, by the title, by the chair at the head of the table. Minho Park thought he was alone in that room with his enemy. He thought his salvation had to come from his own strength or his own surrender. He never imagined that the answer to his prayers was wearing a red vest and holding a pitcher of water. Simone Jackson was invisible to the world of power, but she possessed the one thing that power fears most, the truth. She reminds us that competence does not always wear a uniform of authority. Wisdom is often found in the places we forget to look. So, I leave you with this question tonight. Who are the invisible people in your life? The ones you pass by every day without seeing? And more importantly, what crucial truths might they be holding, just waiting for you to stop, look, and listen?